Okay. Welcome everyone to our screening of Covert Cache. I'm Randi Skurka, and I'd like to wish you all a happy 6th night of Hanukkah from our Beth Shalom community. Please adjust your screen to active speaker, and if you have any questions about the film, please type them into the chat box, and we'll try to address as many as we can at the end. It's my pleasure to introduce to you an award-winning journalist, author, and fearless activist who defends the rights of women and all freedom-loving people against Islamic extremism. She serves as the president of the Council of Muslims Facing Tomorrow and as a fellow on several think tanks as well. She's a tireless and steadfast friend of Israel and the Jewish community, and her latest book, The ABCs of Islamism, is hot off the press, and it's available on Amazon, and I recommend all her writings and journals and her other books as well. She's in the film, and she will now introduce Raza.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Randi. It's a pleasure to be here, and I wish everyone a happy Hanukkah as well. I will begin by going back in time a little. In 2017, I was invited in my work with the Clarion Project. I was invited to the United States, to the US Congress, to testify before the House Subcommittee on National Security. And at that time, when I testified to the US Congress, I made 4 recommendations to them. And one of the recommendations was to take steps to prevent funding of US educational institutions and mosques by foreign extremists, by foreign governments. Now, at that time, this was an idea that I gave them because I know that we've been following this for a long time in our work against terrorism and extremist issues, that foreign funding, we believed, had a role to play in a lot of this. But it wasn't until the Clarion Project started investigating deeper into this issue. And the Clarion Project's Ryan Morrow, who is director of their intelligence network, started investigating the issue of foreign funding coming into US universities. And the shocker was to discover how more than 90 universities disclosed funding that was expected to top over 18 billion in foreign funding revelations. And these are not all the universities who did reveal their funding. I mean, there are many who still have not. Now, my personal concern in this, of course, and for many of us, was funding coming from countries like Qatar and Iran and Saudi Arabia, which of course promotes anti-Semitism, which supports the BDS movement, which promotes extremism. But the shocker was actually, for all of us, including me, when this film was really revealed, was the money that was coming in from countries like the communist regime in China and Russia, and you will see this in this film. So after a year of investigation, there were documents written and there were stories written in the Clarion Project's newsletter, which then led to this documentary being made, which speaks to the issue and actually gives you facts and figures. So without further ado, we will watch Covert Cache.
When you want to get to the heart of something, follow the money. America's Ivy League schools under the microscope. Elite universities are selling themselves, and look who's buying.
These are governments that are hostile to the United States.
Both Harvard and Yale are among the colleges under investigation for failing to report hundreds of millions of dollars in foreign gifts.
Saudi Arabia gave $20 million to Georgetown and to Harvard.
This money should be utilized to lessen the burden of tuition on students, but it's rarely used for that.
When this amount of money is coming in from a foreign government, my first question is why? Why?
It's one of the hidden secrets about foreign influence in America. Just about the entire Ivy League taking money from a foreign government.
And it's gotten to the point now where the funding has ballooned.
What organizations like the Clarion Project have been able to cover is that there have been over $12 billion since 2012 worth of funds from foreign governments that are flowing into the country.
The countries that are donating the most money to American schools are countries with terrible human rights records. Since 2012, Qatar donated $2.9 billion, China $1.2 billion, Saudi Arabia $1.1 billion, United Arab Emirates $469 million, and Russia $137 million. And that's just the amount that's been publicly declared. Most of the money is not declared by the schools.
I want to focus on Yale in particular because it supposedly filed no reports at all for any of the gifts that it did get. Academic institutions just are fundamentally and inherently dishonest when it comes to the money.
The government's investigating some of the nation's most prestigious colleges.
The Department of Education conducted investigations of several prominent American universities.
They sent a letter to the Senate subcommittee, which actually shone a light on what's actually happening.
One university had multiple contracts with the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the People's Republic of China.
That American colleges and universities have provided unprecedented levels of access to foreign governments, corporations, and persons without adequate oversight.
The U.S. Department of Education say they've uncovered more than $6 billion in unreported gifts from countries including Qatar, China, and Saudi Arabia.
What strings are attached to the billions of dollars that are flowing from foreign governments to American schools? And why is this happening in secret?
You know, I don't think we all need to get into our defensive crouches. You know, we're in a globalized world, and universities have relationships all over the world. And I think generally this is all a good thing, but there are always questions that should be asked. You know, who is giving this money and why? And are there strings attached?
Our academic institutions are being bought by foreign interests. And it'd be one thing if it were Western governments. It's another when you see foreign governments that are at odds with US interests buying up influence.
When you have foreign funding, obviously it comes with an agenda. Nobody gives billions of dollars to set up a chair in Islamic studies at a university without the explicit intention of influencing the mindset of the students.
The strategic goal of a country who's pouring millions or billions of dollars into universities is to affect US policy in a number of different ways.
They're trying to influence the minds of the next generation of congressmen, the next generation of lobbyists, the next generation of media, PR professionals, you name it.
My name is Raheel Raza. I'm a practicing Muslim, president of Muslims Facing Tomorrow.
About 3 years ago, I gave testimony to the US Congress.
Remove foreign extremist funding from American campuses.
Why should our educational institutions be warped with a foreign ideology? And this is where Western governments and Westerners sometimes have difficulty grasping what the reality is, and that there is an agenda that is coming on the backs of these petrodollars.
Concerns are rising about China's influence over academic freedom at American universities.
China has given almost $1 billion to America's higher education system. A big part of that funding goes to run what are called Confucius Institutes.
Their purpose is to teach Chinese language and different cultural programming.
There are 66 Confucius Institutes at American colleges and universities, and over 540 worldwide.
But there's an investigation into whether those Confucius Institutes are bringing more than just education courses.
Tonight, there's concern about a Chinese propaganda education program.
It's called the Confucius Institute, and lawmakers say that it's run and funded by the Chinese government.
They pick the curriculum, pick guest speakers.
Critics say that means China controls the narrative of the Confucius Institutes and can shut down opposing viewpoints.
Confucius Institutes have been under fire for years for suppressing free speech and promoting a slanted perception of Chinese history, among other things.
They eliminate certain information from classrooms, for example, like the Tiananmen Square massacre and the Hong Kong protests. They're changing the way that our students learn about China.
This is a foreign country paying to influence students on U.S. soil.
孔子学院很多人都在问我，你是这个软实力的重要组成部分什么？因为我们想扩大我们的这个影响。
And what that means is they have almost a permanent footprint in the U.S. system.
They're also trying to steal sensitive technology.
There are open espionage investigations involving China, now get this, in all 50 states, in high-tech, agriculture, and academia.
The Chinese government has been very effectively stealing America's trade secrets, for generations.
Of the nearly 5,000 active FBI counterintelligence cases currently underway across the country, almost half are all related to China.
America's world-class university system has become a soft target in the global espionage war with China.
One of the most high-profile cases recently was that of Professor Charles Lieber,
the chairman of Harvard University's chemistry department, arrested by FBI agents, charged with lying about more than $1 million in payments from the Chinese government.
A Chinese medical student studying at Harvard is in custody.
Two Chinese-American professors have been fired after
The researcher accused of concealing his ties to China.
We're estimating about $500 billion a year in economic loss just from the country of China.
with the protests and unrest in Hong Kong, and with the Uyghur camps.
Since 2017, up to 1 million Muslim Uyghurs have been placed in what some call concentration camps.
You have to ask yourself what kind of human rights violations are occurring there that we might be overlooking.
We are seeing the biggest internment probably since the end of World War II.
Activists say Beijing has done that to try to eliminate Islam within its borders.
China's crackdown on dissidents is now being described as the cruelest in decades.
And so the next time there's a revolution and people are massacred and they hunt down activists and drag them from their beds and they turn up in a river with their hands bound, you're going to say, well, that's got nothing to do with me. Good luck with that. I mean, if you sleep well at night, then that's who you are.
There are some entities within universities that are more aggressive about seeking money and much less aggressive about caring where it comes from. The MIT Media Lab, in retrospect, is certainly one of those.
Despite the scrutiny, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology has extended its partnership with the Russian research institute Skurka, though that cooperation has raised U.S. concerns ever since it was launched.
We found that MIT received over $83 million from Russia. About half of that came from a Russian official who has been sanctioned for his involvement in Russia's malign activities around the world.
Viktor Vekselberg is a Russian billionaire who is quite close to Vladimir Putin.
The Russian oligarch was sanctioned for his part in helping to, quote, destabilize Western democracies.
U.S. intelligence officials fear the Russians are using Skurka for nefarious purposes.
Russia, it's well known that they have a long-standing information operation to try to influence Americans.
The world woke up to the reality of election meddling when Russia was exposed for interfering in the 2016 US election.
There is no serious dispute that malign foreign actors like Russia are working to subvert our democratic processes and sow chaos in our political system.
So when we see the Russians buying up influence in our education system, it does raise a lot of eyebrows.
A lot of people think that universities should act with some moral center. They should reflect our conscience. That is specifically what most universities do not want to do. You know, they may have Latin phrases that talk about, you know, doing good in the world and so forth, but they are huge corporations and they are loath to do that.
The reality is that colleges in the United States today like to have flashy campuses. They like to have big programs, and that costs money.
U.S. universities are facing new scrutiny over their close ties to Saudi Arabia. Earlier this year, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman visited both Harvard and MIT on his first official tour to the U.S.
Mohammed bin Salman, known as MBS, is the crown prince, but really the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, came over to this country and took a grand tour.
He's taken meetings with Tim Cook, Bill Gates, and has even had Starbucks with Michael Bloomberg.
And he was welcomed as a modern leader, and that was his intent.
But the truth is, MBS is far from the political reformer that he's been presented as.
There's a photo of him shaking hands with the president of MIT. In the background of that photo is a man who was later implicated in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi.
Jamal Khashoggi, a pretty prominent journalist and columnist, went to the Saudi embassy in Turkey and he never came out.
He was inside that Saudi building and he was murdered.
A Turkish official tells the New York Times Saudi agents had dismembered his body with a bone saw they brought for the purpose.
And it was shocking and it was awful.
The CIA has concluded with high confidence that Mohammed bin Salman helped to orchestrate the murder of Jamal Khashoggi.
CNN has now obtained hundreds of text messages showing the Washington Post journalist blunt criticism of the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman,
saying, quote, he's like a beast, like Pac-Man. The more victims he eats, the more he wants.
Talk like this is dangerous for those from a country with one of the world's worst records for human rights.
But even before the Khashoggi incident, the Saudis were and are involved in a war in Yemen and are very credibly accused of war crimes.
The Saudi campaign of airstrikes has been catastrophic.
The man MIT is hosting has created the worst humanitarian crisis on Earth.
When bin Salman visited the United States in the spring, students were protesting it and condemning the visit and condemning the way that MIT and Harvard greeted him as a kind of reformer as opposed to the war criminal that he is.
When he comes to a campus like Harvard or like MIT, that provides him with a level of legitimacy that I don't think he would otherwise have.
You know, they want the prestige. They want the halo effect from being associated with these institutions.
The Saudis are sponsoring lots of sporting events in their country. And, you know, this has been called sports washing. And it's really, in a way, the same thing. It's to say, look, we are a nation of the civilized world that does not murder journalists, does not behead our own dissidents. And we are, you know, one of you. And because look at this, we've got this beautiful, you know, golf tournament going on, this tennis match.
The critical thing with an academic institution is how does the money affect the education? That's really what you're talking about.
I think in many cases, the issue with foreign funding is that what it usually buys is silence. It would almost be crazy to assume that a foreign power is going to keep giving money to a university that critiques that foreign power repeatedly.
No one likes to bite the hand that feeds them. Let me give you an example.
The feud between Canada and Saudi Arabia reaches a new level.
The Canadian government had some pretty mild criticism of MBS and Saudi Arabia, and the regime went crazy.
The Saudi Arabian government announced effective immediately that it was ending scholarships for some 16,000 Saudi students studying in Canada.
Universities charge foreign students tuition fees 4 times higher than their Canadian counterparts.
Mount St. Vincent, for example, took a $900,000 revenue hit.
The big thing that did for us is it exposed just how vulnerable we are.
That's a message that Saudi Arabia is sending out, which is don't criticize. And I believe that the universities heard that.
Institutions can tell themselves that they're maintaining a degree of separation and they're not allowing people to influence their thinking or the choices that they make. But it's really, it starts to seem like a lie when you look at the money.
If you're a parent and your child is going to a university, you can't really know which foreign governments are at least partially helping to fund that education.
We have the foreign government of Qatar, for example. We know Qatar is the second largest funder of international terrorism. They have also spent billions of dollars trying to influence American curriculum, specifically at the Duke UNC program where they are training K through 12 teachers. We have been able to discover that it is a curriculum provided by a theologically motivated government. It is not objective.
The federal government says the Middle Eastern Studies program at Duke and UNC favors Islam while neglecting Christians, Jews, and other faiths in the region. So we filed a Freedom of Information Act request, which would detail why on earth Qatar is trying to influence the curriculum of American students. And so far, UNC has refused to respond.
We've even seen foreign countries go to court to stop Americans from learning about these donations.
For example, my alma mater, Texas A&M, receives hundreds of millions of dollars from the government of Qatar.
This caught the attention of an attorney who was curious about how these donations were being used.
We decided we'd ask them where hundreds of millions of dollars of foreign funding were going and what kind of stipulations were attached to its use.
They filed a FOIA request to get this information, but at the last minute, Qatar sued the state of Texas to block release of this contract.
Texas A&M refuses to divulge. They say that this is due to the fact that they have a secretive agreement and they cannot violate that agreement, even though this is a state university.
I was surprised. How can you argue as a public university that your sources of funding and possible influence are confidential or a business secret? There should be total transparency.
It's a very strange thing when you begin to see foreign countries from the Middle East suing the Attorney General of a state in a democracy for the release of information that should be public.
Hi, welcome to NYU Abu Dhabi.
A lot of Americans probably don't know, but there are a number of branch campuses from American universities in undemocratic countries around the world.
In Qatar, in the UAE, in China, Thailand as well.
There's this expansion happening. You've got universities, you've got Duke is in China, Northwestern is in Qatar, NYU is in Abu Dhabi, Yale is in Singapore, 70 more, right?
Welcome to Northwestern.
Qatar has what they call Education City,
where you can even register with 5 other top American universities.
Qatar is spending billions of dollars so that American universities can set up campus in Doha.
I think it's great that these universities offer this type of education. We also think that you learn best from a free and open education. And the concern here is that the universities are maybe promising something that they can't deliver.
You talk about what liberties and the lack of liberties that you have in this country.
When they go into the community, they must be aware of the cultural conditions. They don't criticize the Islamic faith. They don't criticize the emir. And that's just de rigueur in Arab countries and the Arab monarchies. That's the reality.
It's important to note that Abu Dhabi and the UAE are kingdoms of fear. These are countries where dissent is absolutely illegal.
New York University professor Andrew Ross said he's been barred from entering the United Arab Emirates after he criticized the monarchy's exploitation of migrant laborers.
We've discovered a fairly consistent pattern
human rights abuses among the migrant workforce in the UAE and also in Qatar. So it was quite clear that this was a context for the barring of entry.
Back in 2018, Georgetown University in Qatar canceled a student-led debate because it provoked a controversy within the country. And the debate was focusing on the depiction of God as a woman. And Qatar has a blasphemy law. So the question is there, do they support freedom of expression, or do they want students to respect a blasphemy law? Because the two are fundamentally in tension. And so we actually put GUQ on our 10 worst list of 2019 because this is something that we think is important. You can't promise students something that you can't actually deliver.
And here's the central contradiction. The university, one of the purposes of the university is to promote democratic values.
Yes, right.
Well, how is that going to occur in a non-democratic regime, in a non-democratic country?
Northwestern has a well-known communications school, journalism school.
In 2013, Northwestern University signed a memo of understanding with Al Jazeera, which was intended to facilitate collaboration between the two entities.
We're often involved with projects here at Al Jazeera so Northwestern students can get a true sense of a career in journalism at a major news network.
First of all, let's just note for a minute that Al Jazeera is owned and controlled by Qatar.
Al Jazeera, the Middle East's most high-profile and widely watched network, is considered by many to be a propaganda tool for Islamists in Qatar.
Al Jazeera's biggest problem has always been credibility. It was having a lot of trouble expanding in America.
Al Jazeera America was shuttered in 2016.
Lots of turmoil centering on charges of discrimination, racism, bias, and various resulting lawsuits.
And so Al Jazeera decided to rebrand itself as AJ Plus.
AJ Plus is Al Jazeera's opportunity to tackle a new audience.
Al Jazeera is one of the most influential Islamist propaganda pro-terror outlets in the world.
Al Jazeera most recently got into trouble because they were promoting Holocaust denial in their videos.
ينقسم الناس إلى مجموعات ما بين من ينكر الإبادة أو حتى من يتهم الحركة الصهيونية بتضخيمها لصالح مشروع.
Most of the people, I bet you, who tune into AJ Plus don't even realize that it's an entity of a foreign government with a very specific purpose and goal to influence American public opinion.
Essentially what was happening was the government of Qatar and Al Jazeera were hiring Northwestern University to have its students build Al Jazeera's credibility and improve and expand its operations, including on American soil.
Soon I'll be off to Washington, D.C. for my residency at a news network, so I'm really excited to get more hands-on experience and really put to use what I've learned so far.
This is a war of ideas. We have said this all along. It is not a war of weapons, it is a war of ideas.
Besides funding college campuses, foreign governments fund think tanks, media outlets, activist organizations. College campuses are just one element of this program.
Our democracy is for sale.
Just look at the numbers. Look at the numbers of how many institutions, how much money it is, and how also the trajectory. Ultimately, if it wasn't successful, would the government of Saudi Arabia or the government of Russia continue to pour money into that black hole just out of the goodness of their hearts? Nation states, nations don't do that.
If you look at a map, what you see is a corrupting influence of nationwide proportions.
One way to address the impact of this is to force the academic institutions to be accountable for the decisions that they're making.
American students have a right to know who is behind the curriculum, who is funding the curriculum, what strings are attached.
When you go to buy cigarettes or a health supplement, there's always those warning labels. But when you pick a class or you pick a professor, those labels aren't there. Students are flying blind.
At the end of the day, there are children. They're the future of this nation.
As a mother bear, I want to safeguard everything that is so pure and valuable about the society that we live in and the values that we have. I don't want my daughter growing up without the same choices and the same freedom that I have had.
Okay.
Okay, so we'll continue on with our program, and I just wanted to, I have a few questions that I'd like to pose to Raheel. So my first question is, here in Canada, foreign funding of schools is easier to hide. We have no public data, but we know this problem exists here as well. For example, according to the National Post, there are 10 Confucius Institutes here at places like Seneca College and University of Waterloo, for example. What can we Canadians do to protect our young people from indoctrination with hateful foreign propaganda, as is shown in this film?
Thank you for that question, Randy. You know, our children, and in my case, our grandchildren, are the future of tomorrow. And it's very important to protect their minds and to protect them from being influenced by these foreign governments. So the first thing Canadians need to do is be informed. You know, in the work that I've been doing for over 3 decades now in terms of creating awareness about extremism and terrorism and, you know, the threat to our national security and our national interest, the first thing that we do is create that awareness. In our organization, we have the 3 E's. We say, you know, educate the masses, you know, empower for change. And so the first one, of course, is to expose the problem. And here we are through this film, thanks to the Clarion Project, we are exposing the problem. It's a problem that was hidden for a very long time, and people were not aware that this was happening. So we need to create awareness, we need to talk to people, we need to talk to our elected officials, and we need to demand from universities transparency. So if my child or your grandchild is going to a particular educational institution, you have a right to demand where the funding for that educational institution comes from. Because as you said, that there is a lot of Chinese influence, and Huawei, for example, has invested billions of dollars in various universities across Canada, and they have different programs, some of which are technical. You know, the whole conspiracy of actually funding our educational institutions is done in a very subtle way. Let me just explain something to your audience here, Randy, that in terms of radical extremist influences, the Muslim Brotherhood has a very strong presence in Canada, all across North America, in the West. And if you ever read the mandate or the manifesto of the Muslim Brotherhood, it was very clear. They said themselves, I'm not saying this, the West is evil. It needs to be infiltrated and destroyed from inside. What better way of infiltrating than to get into the educational institutions by investing money in them, because then you can brainwash the minds of the children and the students who are coming to these universities. So it is a very dangerous form of infiltration, and we as Canadians have a right to be aware, and we must be aware.
I just want to respond to what you said, Raheel. Thank you for the answer, but I have here a report by ISCAP talking about the hate groups on campus, specifically Students for Justice in Palestine, and how it is connected to terror organizations like Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood. And if anyone wants to read it, I will send you the link, or if you just Google ISCAP report on Students for Justice in Palestine. It's very important for people to understand where these hate groups are getting their propaganda. And secondly, over the last 3 months, I don't know if our community is aware that there was an anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic video in a civics course, in a grade 10 civics course, accredited by Ontario. It turned up in 3 separate places. And there, in an online course that I looked at myself, there were spokespeople from Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood promoting their viewpoint. And I was very disturbed by it. And it's an ongoing controversy that our community really needs to be aware of. The Minister of Education pulled the video, but it still turned up after he pulled it. So it's a very important ongoing problem, and everyone needs to be aware of it and speak out about it. My second question is, with the new Abrahamic Accords peace deal, the Middle East is rapidly changing. United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, and now Morocco and Bhutan have agreed to establish normalization with Israel. Saudi Arabia is reaching out to the US and Israel for help in challenging Iran for regional dominance in the Mideast. So the question is, how will these changes affect these countries' influence on our universities? Do you think that over time it will lessen their anti-Western bent or the anti-Zionist narrative, which has contributed to an escalation of anti-Semitic activity in Canada?
Well, I am what they call an eternal optimist. So yes, the hope is that this is what the future will bring. But we don't know for sure, because this is just the beginning of the accord. This is just the beginning of relationships. This relationship needs to be built on certain demands from both sides. I think mostly from the side of the US and Israel, that there has to absolutely be some effort and time put into the issue of anti-Semitism, on the issue of BDS movements in universities, the whole anti-Israel propaganda, which, as you know, and we have just seen, obviously gets its funding from these foreign countries. So when you have a country like Iran that says death to Israel, and if they are putting funding into universities in Canada, for example, and they are setting up chairs, obviously the agenda is the same as that of the regime in Iran. How can that change? So if Saudi Arabia and Qatar, well, Qatar is not going to at the moment accept this accord, but let's say those countries that are putting their hand out of friendship to Israel, I think that definitely when they sit around a table, Israel needs to make a demand about them looking at this issue of funding coming from their country into North American universities and the kind of agenda and the curriculum that it supports. And that has to be stopped. You know, especially the support of the anti-Israel Apartheid Week, the BDS movement, which are nothing but a hate fest.
Right. Okay, thank you. So next question, will the adoption of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, recently by Ontario, and by university student unions such as Western University and more recently University of Manitoba, help to lessen anti-Semitic hate speech on campus and beyond, in your opinion?
To be very honest with you, Randy, I don't think it is only the adoption of the IHRA definition that is going to bring about the change. There needs to be much more pressure. There needs to be much more education. There needs to be much more re-education, because these students, to a great extent, have already been brainwashed by the hate that has been surrounding them. And so that has to be washed out. They need to get a new look at these issues. So yes, while our organization, Muslims Facing Tomorrow, definitely supports the IHRA definition, and we say, yes, we must fight anti-Semitism at every level. But tell me, are the university professors also as enthusiastic about fighting anti-Semitism? If they were, then you wouldn't have the BDS movement in universities. You wouldn't have Hate Fest. You wouldn't have Israel Apartheid Week. So there needs to be a mass movement by people from all walks of life, people of faith, people of no faith, people who are secular, and they must come together to say, stop this hate. And it is hate. There's no other word to describe anti-Semitism except that, it is hate against a particular community, and they have to speak out and say that this must stop. And at the same time, we know for a fact that when this funding is coming into universities from those countries that are not democratic and those countries where anti-Semitism is rife, then obviously that same ideology is being taught to the students that is coming in through that money, which has an agenda behind it. So there is a lot of work that needs to be done, but I think the first thing we need to do is be aware that this problem exists and it's growing at multiple levels. And we need to ask for transparency, we need to demand answers, and we need to educate ourselves about the level of the problem. You mentioned the ISGAP report, which is excellent. ISGAP does great deal of work on the issues, of course, of anti-Semitism. We need to educate ourselves, read the reports, go to the Clarion Project, sign up for the newsletter, because they expose everything that is happening in US universities. And then from there, we start taking steps to make sure that our children and grandchildren will not be brainwashed into these ideologies.
Right. On the point of education and learning the facts, I serve on the board of Stand With Us Canada, and our motto is education is the road to peace and the facts speak for themselves. And what we do is we try to identify and train student leaders on campus and give them strategies to counter all these movements that you spoke about, BDS and Israel Apartheid Week and all these other things. And here's an example of one of our materials, 25 answers to tough questions about Israel. It can be downloaded online from standwithus.com. If anyone wants some of these, I have them, but we do have a lot of materials that are educational materials, just so we can learn the facts. When they throw these accusations at us that are misleading and often lack context and exaggerated, and some of them are just plain wrong. But people hear them so often that they, like you said, they get brainwashed. And if anyone wants to learn more about Stand With Us, please contact me and I will. Or if any of one's children or grandchildren experience anti-Semitic hate or they're harassed on campus, we have student leaders and a campus coordinator that will support you. So I'm happy to provide that information for anyone. And I didn't see any questions on the chat box. I'm just wondering if any of the audience have any questions for Raheel. Is there anyone that has a question for Raheel? I found that the story in the film about Al Jazeera having the journalism school at Northwestern University was very disturbing. That was really brainwashing, and I found it very disturbing. Do you have anything to say about that, Raheel, the journalism
Yes,
school?
absolutely. You see, media today, social media and media is the way people, masses get their information. 99% of the population gets their information from media. So if the media school at Northwestern is being influenced by this foreign funding, and these are the young people who are going to go out and become journalists, it's a very, very frightening prospect. You know, you talked about Stand With Us, which focuses on education. The question is, if that education is being, what is the word I want to use, is being sullied by money that is coming in from certain, outside interests, then how can we fight that? We have to make sure that our children and grandchildren are not being brainwashed into ideologies that are against democracy and gender equality and pluralism, all things that we value in the West, which are not the same values of the Confucius Institute or any of these Islamist countries that are funding these universities. And my question would be to our governments and our leaders, why on earth are they allowing this foreign funding to come in? And of course, I have to tell you, since Covert Cash was released and since it was made, there have been a lot of stories in mainstream newspapers across America about this funding. And I believe investigations are underway, and there is, there are more demands for transparency. But this is all a long process. In the meantime, we as ordinary citizens, as parents and grandparents, have a right to demand answers.
Okay, I have a couple questions here. No, that's good that the film stimulated these inquiries. So that was one of the purposes of the film, to raise awareness and for people to be aware and to ask, and for inquiries to be made by journalists and others. Alan asks, what is the status of Al Jazeera now in North America? From what I understand, I mean, I see it on social media all the time. So it's very pervasive. What do you have to say about status of Al Jazeera in North America?
Well, according to the film, they were banned in the US at some point in time, but they are very, very active on social media. And you have to remember that this is billions of dollars in funding that goes into Al Jazeera. They're a huge corporation. And so, they also have other names that they use for their different tentacles that they have. They don't always use the name Al Jazeera, so they use social media, and they have various avatars and entities that they use, but they get their message out.
Okay, the next question is from Gary. He wants to know if the money is being sent from the foreign countries to buy entrance for their own students.
I'm sorry, I'm not clear on that question.
I think what he's asking is, are they sent? Well, we saw in the film that they are sending students from all these countries. So I guess that answers the question. They're,
but it's not, yes, I got that. But it's not always a student who is being funded to go to that universities. What they're doing is they'll fund a chair, for example, in that university. They'll fund a department in that university. It's not always a specific student that they're funding, although there are a lot of foreign students. And I'll tell you a quick little story about, would say about 7 years ago. I was traveling across the United States with a film on a diary, and I went to a very small university town. And when I went to the university, I was shocked to see the number of Saudi students there. And they were dressed in their Saudi garb. So I asked the head of their International Students Union, why are there so many Saudi students here when you know that Saudi Arabia has a problem with this ideology? He said they not only bring in money, they buy homes, they buy cars, and the US Embassy in Riyadh, when they give a visa to a female Saudi student, they allow her to bring a guardian, because Saudi women are not allowed to leave the country without a male guardian. So that male guardian also gets to come and sit in class with this female student. I mean, wow. This is how much they pander to these people who have the money. So, you can't blame these countries. I mean, I would say I blame our governments for allowing this to happen. So the money speaks for it. These guys rebuilt the entire campus. They bought new cutlery and crockery for the cafeteria because they said it could be tainted. They buy homes, they buy big cars, and so everyone is silent when the money speaks.
There's a lot of money involved.
It's a big money involved.
Even in the film, they talked about a Canadian school. I think they said there were 16, when there was a kerfuffle with the Saudi government, I think they said there were 16,000 students or something.
Yes.
And I remember hearing it on the news, and I was also shocked. I had no idea that there were so many thousands of Saudi students all over and bringing so much money. And it was a real eye-opener for me.
It is an eye-opener, and they've been coming in quietly. A lot of them were medical students. And I knew that they were coming in, but our government has its eyes closed to these issues. As long as they're bringing in the money, nobody asks questions. But the ideology that they bring in, obviously, it's going to be spread.
Do you think, so you think that when the students come in, they're bringing this ideology themselves and spreading it in the school?
Yes, from some of these countries, which are Muslim Brotherhood-oriented countries, some of the students that are sent to foreign universities are not sent there to study. They are sent there to spread the propaganda, to spread the ideology. Right. They are paid big bucks. They're given apartments. They're given cars. They're not there to further their intellect. They made it very clear, and I've spoken to some of them. They don't care to even study. They are here because they are here to spread the propaganda and the ideology of the country that they have come from. And it's all done very subtly.
And I think these are the ones that are starting up these groups on campus.
Yes, well, of course they are. I mean, they have a mandate. They have been given a mandate, and they've been told, we'll pay your lodging, we'll buy you a car, everything will be covered, you'll get a stipend, your tuition will be paid for. This is what you have to do.
Right. Okay, so the next question from Gary was about technology. I think they mentioned it in the movie, the stealing of technology. I don't know exactly what the question was. Let me look at it again.
Yes, I don't have all the facts on that, but what I have read about China is that there is a, especially with the involvement of Huawei, if you go to the website of the Clarion Project, there are reports there, and you can understand that they are also focusing on technology. They have very subtle ways in which they fund these organizations, but the connection, and let me, I saw something here, just a second, let me tell you that, for example, the most important research partnerships with Huawei Technologies is a AL-based surveillance, intrusive data collection, and smartphone and general communications monitoring. So the interest and investment and partnerships in technology is very much there.
Okay, so one more question from Jerry. He says, his question is, if the universities depend on the foreign cash, then what is the alternative? In other words, like there's no choice, they depend on this cash. It's kind of a cynical viewpoint. I think we still need to be aware of the influence, even if they do have foreign funding.
It is a very tricky question. I would say, let's go look back 15, 20 years ago. Universities have existed for such a long time. They were not always dependent on foreign funding. This is a relatively new phenomena. And this is where our governments have to be questioned. Why should universities have to depend on foreign funding? Why can't our own governments fund the universities? Why can't donors fund the universities? And of course they do. There are many universities that survive on donors, but those donors need to be local. Those donors should not be foreign governments meddling in the affairs of our educational institutions. And, there needs to be more focus by the government to have roundtables and sit down and figure out how they can bail out the universities who are sinking.
Right. Doreen asks about a screening process. Do you think that these universities have screening processes where they try to evaluate the students to see what their backgrounds are, or I don't know how that would work. Maybe they would be able to get around it.
I think the screening process is to see how much money they're bringing in. I don't know what's happening in the United States, but I do know in Canada, for example, I know someone very closely who worked at the airport, and he said that the Saudi students came in with absolutely no screening. They just got their visas and they walked in, and it was all done very quietly. So that public and media would not know. So there wasn't any major screening required. I mean, when my family came to Canada 32 years ago, we had to get police reports from like 5 generations back and where we lived, in the last 86 years. My great-grandfather's police report. I'm just giving an example. I mean, we went through stringent security measures to come here. That doesn't happen anymore. If you have the money, you can buy your way into the country.
Right. Scary.
It is scary. It is scary. It is also a wake-up call. If all of us do not really get shocked by this, and if we don't start questioning and talking to people, then there's no point in what this whole process is about. We have to ask hard questions. We have to speak out. It's our future generations who are at stake. I'm terrified of what my grandchildren are going to learn when they start going to university. I mean, as it is, we are dealing with woke culture and all sorts of gender issues, which are so troubling. That's a whole other ball game. But you're talking now about, an anti-Semitic course in the school curriculum. What else are they being taught? And parents are not aware of this. So let's question, let's be aware, let's be much more vigilant about the future of our children and grandchildren, and not let them be brainwashed by foreign ideologies.
Right. Well, I think that about wraps it up. Thank you for answering all our questions and for your comments and for all the work that you do. You mentioned the film Honor Diaries. I was at the premiere of that film in Toronto, and it was outstanding. Maybe we'll screen that one next time, and you can.
That would be wonderful.
More
there's another very good documentary actually coming out. Clarion Project is in the process of completing that. I'll let you know when that's done, and I'll be happy to talk to you about that. But in the meantime, let's just keep on working towards exposing what the problem in our universities are.
Yes, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
I want to thank our audience, thank Raheel and Marnie for screening the film. And I hope everyone has a good evening and enjoy the rest of Hanukkah.
Thank you.